3. All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And on the program today, we are joined by two guests. We're joined by returning champion David Swanson of World Beyond War. And of course, David is the author of several books, including When the World Outlawed War and Leaving World War II Behind. And I am also super honored. We are joined by first-time guest Meda Benjamin of Codepink, which is a brilliant anti-imperialist, anti-war organization, and very much feminist-driven and feminist-led, but yeah, woman-led as well. I think it's a good way to to describe it, right, Medea?
Right.
And Medea is also the author of several books, including one on Iran, which people should check out, US-Saudi relations. And they are the author, and both of my guests, of course, are the authors of a new book about NATO. And Medea, what is the title of this new book that you co-authored with David?
It's NATO, What You Need to Know.
Fantastic. And so let's let's get straight into it. And first of all, Medea, it's an honor to finally get the chance to speak to you. I've followed your work for years, and we actually met very briefly at a Palestine festival in London when Jeremy Corbyn was still leader. The late John Pilger spoke at that thing, and I had the chance to meet you very briefly as I was just leaving day one of the event. So it's an honor to finally get the chance to speak to you, once more.
Wonderful.
And so the first question now, NATO is a topic which has been which has been talked about many times on the program, but because your book is about NATO and what people need to know, I then have to ask this question, and forgive me if it is repetitive, but what is the central premise for NATO that is often presented to the public, and what do you think is NATO's central myth that needs to be debunked? Let's start with you, Medea, and then David, you can respond.
Well, it depends. I mean, when NATO was first created, it was to stop Soviet expansionism, but of course the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. It was to stop the revival of militarism in Europe with a strong US presence on the continent, and it was to encourage the political integration of Europe. But these things have changed and evolved over time. And of course, as we make very clear in the book, when the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991, this should have been the time for NATO to dissolve as well. But the organizers of NATO had other plans and have been searching since then for different reasons to continue their existence. And today we see NATO expanding all over the globe, and it getting revived, particularly with the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
David, your response.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
In recent days, we've seen the Secretary of General of NATO publicly push the United States to, and this is one example among others, to allow the use of US donated weaponry to attack inside Russia. And then we've seen the President of the United States do as NATO asked. We've seen the Secretary General posing at press conferences with president after prime minister as if he is the leader of some nation. And so NATO has now become this Frankenstein monster that's, telling its owner, telling the government that used to have it as its lapdog what to do. Just as you see generals publicly telling President Barack Obama to escalate the war in Afghanistan and him saluting and doing it. Traditionally, NATO has been the servant of the US government with the pretense that it was the servant of a dozen governments or dozens of governments. And so the notion that NATO is somehow advancing democracy is absurd, because it's taking power away from governments that are at least marginally pretending to be accountable to publics and concentrating it in the hands of these absolutely unelected, undemocratic, weapons dealing hacks with their own agenda. The other thing that NATO creates and that people accept is that it is up against some other side that isn't quite human, right? There's no such thing as a vicious cycle. So if the people in Finland or Sweden are scared of the evil Russians, there's no such thing as talking to the evil Russians. One must simply join NATO and militarize. And if that's what scares Russians and they militarize, and that scares the Swedes and the Finns more and they militarize more, well, that's not the fault of anyone, because the Russians aren't people you could have done anything else with. You simply had no choice whatsoever. You didn't want to do it, but you had to. And it's not a vicious cycle, because there's no predicting what the evil, monstrous Russians will do, even though they're going to do the exact same damn thing that you're doing. And so the myth is that NATO isn't optional, that it's defensive, it's a last resort, there's no choice about it, and it's not creating the problem. The reality is that you couldn't be creating this problem. It takes two to tango, or to have an arms race, or to destroy the world in nuclear war. And you couldn't have it happening without NATO. And there are choices, there are better ways. It's absolutely unnecessary.
That's a perfect segue to this question. And actually, before I talk about the, when NATO was founded and the problematic membership of Portugal, Spain, and later Greece, Medea, I have to ask then this question, which is how do you push back against some of the because half truths, of course, are always the most difficult form of propaganda to debunk, because there's always an element of truth, hence why they call it a half truth. So what would you say to the former Eastern European communist countries, who say that NATO is a necessary evil because look at how the Soviet Union supposedly liberated us from fascism, and of course they'll use examples of when such and such an Eastern European communist state backed by the Soviet Union was was brutal in its suppressive of political opponents and so forth. And then of course with the whole situation that we have now with Ukraine, with Russia's invasion, of course the problem there didn't start with Russia's invasion. Many people argue Russia was provoked into a military response. But what do you so how do you respond to that and that other argument that NATO is that NATO, even if we may not like what the US has done in such and such a country, we still need it because look at what Russia has done with its invasion of Ukraine, and Russia still meddling in Eastern European affairs, even though it's no longer a communist state.
Well, if you're talking to people in the United States, I think it's good to say that what would the United States do if there was a military alliance opposed to the United States that starting encroaching in its territory from Mexico or from Canada? That countries that are large countries like the US, like China, like Russia, have their own security interests, have their own definitions of what is an existential threat to them. And you have to understand that. You might not agree with it, you might not like it, but you have to know that that exists. And when we see what NATO has done to make Russia feel so insecure over these years with its expansion precisely at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, you have to recognize, as we have documented over and over again in this book from all kinds of experts and diplomats, that Russia was going to be forced to react. So I think what you need to say is that we go back to what David said. There are other ways to deal with Russia, and that is through diplomacy. That is through having security agreements, but not ones that are poking at Russia, that are provocations, that are making Russia feel that it is the one that is being surrounded and victimized.
Engler has our good friend of the show, Eve Engler, a Canadian historian, anti-imperialist thinker, and so forth. He's been on the program, and he did a couple of articles on his website, which The Real News interviewed him about when it was one of NATO's anniversaries, about how NATO actually was used to actually suppress the left, mainly, the communist movements of Eastern, of Western Europe, but also just in general to sort of like suppress the left and co-opt them to make them into, NATO socialists. I'm wondering if your book talked at all about that. David, you can go, and then Medea then.
Well, yes, the book does talk about that a good deal. I think a good deal of it thanks to Meda Benjamin. And there's no question that NATO was set up in part to suppress leftist socialist movements within Europe, to work with the US military and the developing CIA and those left behind in Europe to sabotage movements for a more leftist politics in Italy and France and throughout Europe, led largely by people who had led the resistance to Nazism in the war, out of which we got NATO. And so when you see President Biden glorifying D-Day and excluding the Russians, and the success of Hollywood in having persuaded, darn near the whole world outside of Russia, that the United States won World War II, and that everything since World War II is some sort of an echo of the mythology of World War II. This is the history, and I think with regard to what do you say to people in Eastern Europe, we have to remember that these are people who took the Soviet Union apart through nonviolent activism and knew they had done so, and in many places began to make plans for nonviolent resistance to future Russian invasions, and formally put it into their governments in some places like Lithuania. We're going to have unarmed civilian defense. We're going to train the people to do it. And it's been undermined and sabotaged and taken apart and militarized and made subservient to so-called military defense. And yet you couldn't have the problem without NATO. And as Medea has written and spoken about so many times, there was an agreement on the table a month into this catastrophic war where the big negotiating point was Ukraine has to commit to not being in NATO and Russia will get the hell out. This was central to the plan put forward by Russia prior to the invasion. This has been the sticking point throughout. NATO would rather have this war go on, apparently, even if it leads to nuclear apocalypse, than have Ukraine say it won't be in NATO. What other sticking point is there as central and large as that one to this war? And yet, how much is it talked about? What media reports on the war mention it at all?
Well, as Bob Dylan said, I learned to hate the Russians all throughout my entire life. So there's the answer to that. So Medea, talk a bit more about NATO's anti, NATO's sort of anti-democratic actions, and explain also why when NATO was founded, why the membership of Portugal and Spain and later Greece, sort of counters, the myth that NATO is this collective bunch of liberal democracies against, an evil Soviet Russian Empire or an evil capitalist Russian Empire led by Putin.
Well, yes, when NATO was first formed and when Portugal became a member of NATO, it was still ruled by the dictator Salazar, and it had a vast empire in Africa where it was waging very, very dirty wars to try to keep hold of their empires. Just as Britain, France, and Belgium also had their empires in Africa and were waging vicious campaigns. So whether it was the lack of democracy at home, as in the case of Spain and Portugal and Greece, or it was the continuance of the colonial empires of other of the NATO organizations, both of them belie the myth put forward that NATO was an alliance of democratic countries trying to save the world from dictatorships.
And can you talk about yeah, because Spain was yeah, because Spain was under Franco, fascist dictator. Portugal was under Salazar, also a fascist dictator. Now, but talk about Greece, because I find that's an interesting case, because Greece was, I think it wasn't a member of NATO when NATO was first founded, but didn't they later join as a member of NATO when the Western backed, the US, Canadian, British backed fascist dictatorship, people who actually collaborated with the Nazis overthrew the social democratic leader of Greece, and then they became and then yeah, Greece was ruled by a military junta for much of that period of the Cold War, 60s up until the early 1980s, and so and of course, but NATO, but yeah, did NATO play like a part of in that coup and later preserving that right wing junta?
Well, yes, NATO, Greece joined NATO in 1952, as well as Turkey, which was no democracy either. And Greece was ruled by a ruthless Western-backed government from 67 to 74. And the NATO membership of Greece and Turkey's membership were also ways for those two undemocratic governments to be given not only the veneer of democracy, but also the support of NATO countries. And this is true even when there were changes in those governments, like in the case of Turkey, there were military coups in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and that did not even affect the NATO membership.
Unbelievable. And but David, now NATO, of course, is known as a military alliance, but it seems to me as if NATO has been involved in, if not in covertly, usurping democracy in the forms of color revolutions. Because I know you talked about how, end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was dissolved through nonviolent means, but there's more and more evidence showing that well, I don't know if you can blame NATO per se on this. I don't know if your book answers that, but there is no doubt about that. But there is no doubt about it that a lot of the Western secret services and their unions, like the National Endowment of Democracy, USAID, played a huge part in actually dissolving the Soviet Union, communism in Eastern Europe through what are called color revolutions, which of course NATO also did with Ukraine. When Yanukovych was overthrown, and then all of that leading up to that, bloody situation. I'm curious your response on that.
Well, I just wanted to add on Turkey that NATO also, they call it NATO, it's the United States, keeps nuclear weapons there. And there was a coup not too many years back at the very base where they keep the nuclear weapons. And there was no question of keeping Turkey in NATO. In fact, US and Turkish backed troops were fighting each other in Syria, and there was no question of keeping Turkey in NATO no matter what. So there are not really any standards other than privatizing and selling off and buying lots of weapons. There aren't really any standards for being in NATO. The so-called color revolutions, as far as I understand, come after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but are indeed in most cases are largely nonviolent, and in most cases involve very legitimate grievances from actually sincere people, but in every case are being pushed and promoted by the United States and the CIA and USAID, and often quite openly as means of advancing Western-friendly nations. I mean, this has been the push and pull
on top of that, let's not forget that term, reactionary.
Let's not forget who?
Reactionary forces. The West is always backing reactionary forces in whatever region.
Typically, yes, there are no standards other than enemy of my enemy for getting U.S. Military support. I mean, this is open and public. Most of the world's dictatorships get U.S. military support and buy U.S.-made weapons if they aren't given them. But this is what developed in Ukraine over decades. The U.S. and Russia, neither one quite happy with Ukraine being neutral, and forces within Ukraine seeking power through making Ukraine not be neutral, and the U.S. Clearly and publicly supporting a coup in 2014 after earlier coups and overthrows in Ukraine. And the people of Ukraine for years and years didn't want to join NATO, didn't want to take sides. And even the year after the coup, you had an agreement with some degree of independence in the east of Ukraine. But the West and NATO didn't want it. And NATO, I mean, the funny thing is that we've been doing these webinars and people like us have been talking to each other for over a couple of years now about all the obvious evidence that people in the West pushed for NATO expansion, knowing or even wishing for it to lead to just this war. And who is it that comes out and publicly says that? And it's hardly noticed in the news, but the Secretary General of NATO, right? So you have to be a crazy leftist peace activist or the Secretary of General of NATO who can get away with blurting out the truth. And maybe people would care if they knew, but he isn't electable or unelectable by anybody. He's the opposite of a democratic leader. And he says, it was NATO expansion. Russia would have wanted peace if not for NATO expansion, and we didn't want that, and we pushed ahead with NATO expansion. This is so obvious. I mean, you have to own a television. You have to probably be in the United States. You have to be dedicated to respectable U.S., probably Democratic Party politics. I don't know what it takes to avoid knowing this, but the Secretary General of NATO admits it quite openly and suffers no consequences.
Well, NATO has a very good propaganda system, which leads to this question, which is Yugoslavia and the Yugoslavian civil wars, and so Medea, so does the book talk about Yugoslavia, and what do you think it's important that people actually should understand about the breakup of Yugoslavia and the Yugoslavian civil wars, and of course the attack on Serbia, and why that was an illegal attack on the country, regardless of people's various opinions on Serbia being mostly in the wrong during the Civil War and whatnot?
Well, I just want to say before that when we talk about NATO, you Google NATO, and what you will see is defensive alliance, defensive alliance, defensive alliance, and that people need to understand how NATO has been involved in Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Ukraine. And I hope maybe we'll get to also talk about what's going on in Georgia right now, because I see it very much as the beginnings of a Ukraine type situation. David, could you talk about Yugoslavia? Because I have to step away for 1 second.
Sure, no problem.
I will be glad to do my best, which will not be as good as Medea's. But Yugoslavia is the turning point, right? NATO is in danger of having no raison d'etre of the Warsaw Pact, which, by the way, was created several years after NATO was created, and was in no way, shape, or form ever the reason for NATO existing. But you go through, the first half century almost of NATO, with the propaganda being it's all about the Soviet Union. If it weren't for the Soviet Union, we wouldn't need NATO, and the Soviet Union vanishes. It's a little bit worrisome for NATO, because intelligent people who you would think would know better, all believe that since the principal propaganda excuse went away, the militarism is going to go away. They're going to get a peace dividend. The militaries are going to be dismantled. NATO's going to be shut down. We're going to have a world where we invest in people and environment. And no. NATO, because the push for domination, for weapons sales, for profits, for sadistic thrills, I mean, none of that stuff changed. And so NATO's looking around for what it can do. And no NATO member is attacked. No NATO member is threatened. There is no, we must defend all the NATO members. But there is the possibility of stirring up some greater violence in Yugoslavia and riding into the rescue, or at least pretending to. And so the West facilitates the dismantling of Yugoslavia and backs and promotes criminal, thuggish, outlawish forces in Kosovo and in Bosnia, and the West comes in with bombing campaigns that make things worse and lead to greater slaughters, but are depicted and often with the chronology of events reversed as humanitarian rescue missions. And this is critical, because this is NATO with US and other Western nations backing it, but not all NATO members. It's some NATO members and so NATO has decided that it can do wars that involve only some of its members, that don't involve an attack on any of its members, that are illegal under the UN Charter. And we can get to this if you want, but I would argue that NATO's very existence is illegal under the UN Charter, and that it can sell them to the Western public as somehow internationally sanctioned by NATO itself. Who needs the UN? We're an international body. And so you have NATO wars now. NATO didn't have any wars until then, after which you got NATO taking over wars in Afghanistan and destroying Libya. And again, many NATO members, not others, helping out in Iraq, but NATO getting involved as NATO, because some of its members want to wage wars and it wants to wage wars. And so NATO doesn't go away because of Yugoslavia. NATO expands because of Yugoslavia. NATO expands its principal business, which is the weapons dealing business. And it develops a permanent occupation and training ground where it can drag in new members and partners and potential members and have them get involved in occupying Yugoslavia, which hasn't ended to this day. So, yes, something of a turning point, and I think not the stellar example of a just war that some US professors will tell you.
Yes, exactly. Yugoslavia. We've talked about how that's often promoted as the good war. In fact, that's a perfect segue to Afghanistan, which is often argued as one of those good wars. Now, Medea, I want your response on this, and David as well. Okay, so Yugoslavia, you can make the argument, and I think you've won the argument that that was a completely, illegal, immoral. Well, all wars are immoral, but in an illegal, immoral war because all of the former Yugoslavian, because all of former Yugoslavia were not NATO members. Kosovo was not a NATO member, and Serbia was not a NATO member. So when it was an internal dispute which should have been, dealt with diplomatically and so forth. But you can
Can I
make
just
yeah.
I'm really sorry, Youri. Can I just add that there's nothing legal at all whatsoever about NATO waging a war should a NATO member be attacked? NATO is
Okay,
not
well,
a
interesting. Okay, well,
law-making
interesting
body.
because okay. So before you answer that, then okay, but couldn't you make but when it comes to Afghanistan, couldn't you make the argument that hey, the U.S. was attacked by terrorists on 9/11, and they were arguably being harbored in Afghanistan by the Taliban. So doesn't NATO have a right to attack that country, given that a member state, the United States, was attacked by, Al Qaeda being harbored in Afghanistan? So
Well,
yes, I'm curious your
that
response to Matthias. Actually,
the
Matthias
last
can
bit.
respond, then David can respond.
Well, let David go on about why that's not legal, because he was beginning that argument.
Okay.
Well, I was going to say the last bit is wrong on a technicality in that the Taliban was willing to turn bin Laden and company over to be put on trial elsewhere. But I think it's, there isn't a NATO member country that hasn't been attacked by foreign terrorists and hasn't treated those attacks as crimes to be prosecuted as terrorist crimes. There is one and only one NATO member that has taken criminal acts by terrorists and described them as a war and used Article 5 of the NATO Charter to demand that all NATO members join in a war. The United States is more equal than other NATO members. It's different. When the United States wants a war, it drags all the other NATO members in, but that doesn't make it legal. And even if you imagine that somehow the scenario is different from all the other ones and it perfectly fits the things described in the NATO Charter, there's nothing legal about the NATO Charter under the UN Charter. Right? Under the United Nations, war is illegal with very limited exceptions. If it's defensive, if Afghanistan were attacking the United States and the United States fighting them off, or if the UN authorizes it, which the UN did not and doesn't do. And so NATO going in and bringing all its members doesn't make it more legal any more than me robbing the corner grocery store and bringing all my friends would make it legal. It just doesn't. And it's this basic idea that everybody's got in their heads that if NATO does it en masse, then it's more legal than if just one country does it. Why?
Well, let's also go back to the issue of what should the US have done after 9/11. And many of us were saying that it should be treated as a crime against humanity and go after the individuals who attacked us, not use it as an excuse to invade a country. And of course, if you were going to invade a country, given that 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, maybe that should have been the country invaded. But of course, we are peacemakers. We don't want to invade any country.
Exactly.
So the US should have never invaded Afghanistan. And of course, we see that 20 years years later when the US pulled out with its tail between its legs and left Afghanistan in a worse position than it was when we came in there. So if you want to look at an example of how the US has led NATO down this horrific path of using militarism as a response to violence, Afghanistan is the perfect example, with the Taliban back in control after the trillions of dollars and all the deaths and destruction that US and its NATO allies caused in Afghanistan.
And also, important footnotes, the US backed the Taliban for years. And the US backed those very forces that, you know, took down the World Trade Center. The US had backed those in their quest to end communism in Afghanistan. So, but then Medea, as a feminist, I've always been wanting to ask you this question, which is which is, as a feminist, explain why NATO isn't something that feminists should be supporting. And of course, you've probably dealt with lots of, you know, liberal feminists, or what some critics call femeonationalism, like femeonationalists who argue that Afghanistan was a just war because we were fighting the Taliban, which is this oppressive patriarchal system on steroids, and therefore we were just in supporting that war because we were going to unleash, you know, feminism and better rights for children and whatnot. How do you push back against how do you push back against that argument?
Well, for me, feminism means being against violence and against war. And whether it was the case of Afghanistan, where the oppression of women was used as an excuse for the invasion of Afghanistan, and the US maybe helped some women in Kabul to get better education and job opportunities in the rest of the country, it was still the same. And you can't bring in women's liberation on the back of bombs. That has to come from within. And of course, I think it's important now, and there's so few women that are supporting the women in Afghanistan now to try to get them the rights that they deserve. But it's certainly not through military means. And then when you look at NATO, this goes back to what David said in the very beginning. It's just the absolute opposite of diplomacy, of cooperation, of learning to live together on a limited planet, especially when we have the kind of climate crisis that we have right now. Women and many men are supposed to be nurturers, are supposed to care for the not only immediate family, but the larger family, the global family, as well as the ability to continue to exist on this planet for future generations. So I would say anybody who is a real, genuine feminist has to be somebody who is opposed to war and opposed to NATO.
Well, a quick follow-up then is, explain who NATO was backing in Afghanistan, the Northern Alliance, because I think many people would be shocked that they also practice very brutal patriarchy and very anti-human practices as well. The Northern Alliance in Afghanistan.
David, you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, it's absolutely right, Youri, that there were laws being passed by the new government in Afghanistan to strip women of rights. There were warlords backed by the US and NATO who were as vicious and brutal and misogynist as anyone on earth. But I think the principal lesson, as Medea said, is that this was not the way to improve things in any lasting manner. The fact that you're fighting a war against someone with horrible, evil practices, and there's no question that they were, and there's no question that things have gotten worse post-war for many women in Afghanistan, doesn't make it a good thing. It was predictable that you were going to empower these sorts of people, and it did empower them. And those who predicted that this would be a failure and not work were absolutely right and should now be allowed on television. And yet the thinking is, well, we did our very, very best. No one could have done any better. We will never, examine what we've thought would work and failed. And this just leads to further disasters. If you want to talk about improving women's rights in Afghanistan, you have to work on it in a way that might succeed and show some success, and not use it as a justification for war. And Amnesty International buying up ads to say NATO keep fighting in Afghanistan for the sake of women, and putting them on bus stops in Chicago where we're marching and protesting and veterans are throwing back their medals. This tells you what the divide is, not just in the activist world, but in people's heads. Because people imagine that if you take a good cause that everybody loves, you can justify anything with it, even the very destruction of that very cause, as long as you're killing lots of people in its name. And it isn't so. It just isn't. Youri, you and I and others have had this conversation about the US Civil War. Most of the world liberated everybody without having to kill so many people or destroy so many places. And the US could have done it. John Brown went into Harper's Ferry and everybody lost their minds, and there had to be blood. It could have been otherwise.
We're gonna save that. We're gonna save that debate for another day, because I actually do want to push back a little bit about the Civil War. But yeah, no, you're completely right when it comes to NATO. In fact, Medea, you actually wanted to talk more about Eastern European affairs, and I think that's great. Which is talk to us about. I hope we still have time to talk about Ukraine, but actually talk to us about what NATO is doing currently in Georgia right now. So there's been mass protests going on in Georgia. The West depicts these as, again, wonderful, liberal, little bit of socialist, like freedom fighters against forces who are ready to sell their sovereignty down to Putin. But what's really happening in Georgia, and how is NATO behind it?
Well, I don't really know exactly how NATO is behind it, but I know that the Western governments, and particularly the United States, are trying to manipulate legitimate gripes, just like in the case of Ukraine, and turn them into anti-government forces. And it's so interesting that there was this law that members of the government in Georgia have been trying to pass that says if you're an NGO that gets over 20% of your money from a foreign source, you will have to register and declare that you are in doing the bidding of a foreign country. And actually, I think that's pretty legitimate. And the NGOs that are getting most of their funding from foreign sources, particularly the US, like they get through the National Endowment for Democracy.
Which is a CIA front, let's be honest.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly don't want to disclose their sources, and that the US and other Western countries are behind this effort. And so you even get the irony of groups like Transparency International that are saying, this is a terrible law. We should not have to disclose where we are getting our funds from. And it is very reminiscent of the US backing for the Maidan uprising in Ukraine. I don't know how this one is going to end, but it is so tragically ironic that the US and the West can interfere, throwing money like they did in Ukraine, billions of dollars, into creating a more robust, quote, civil society that is pro-Western and anti-Russian. And yet, when there are similar kind of forces, even trying to influence our government, meaning Israel, there is no outcry against that. Either you're for or you're against foreign interference in the internal affairs of other countries.
But I find that so shocking because now I'll admit I've not been following too closely what's been going on in Georgia, but I am hoping to have Boyan Stanislavski of the Barricade, who's actually interviewed you and one of your colleagues when you were both in Poland about NATO and Eastern European affairs. But it's hilarious when watching any coverage or even just like reading the headlines of these mass protests that's happening in Georgia, which I know are mostly being funded by, by the West. They're saying that they're against this Russian law, but the way you outlined it, actually, it's not that it has nothing even really to do with Russia. It's just to do like, hey, if you're an NGO, you have to be transparent about who's funding you. So the protest should be so they should be calling it an American law, but it's hilarious how they managed to have spin this into Russia meddling in Georgia's affairs when I'm curious, both of your responses to that. David, your response to Medea's.
Well, to some extent, there's consistency, right? People in the US government want to be able to meddle around the world and want Israel to be able to meddle in the US government. But if Russia or anyone who's ever been to Russia buys a Facebook ad or tries to influence a US election in any way, well, then there's hell to pay, right? And this is the hypocrisy. It's just staggering beyond belief. The US insists on the right as a good global citizen to interfere in other countries' elections, to even seek the overthrow and dismantling and breakup of other countries, and considers it the biggest threat to peace and the world and the rules-based order for anyone outside the United States to try to have any influence on US elections. I think pretty much the whole world ought to get to vote in US elections. They impact the whole world, and there's nothing remotely clean or respectable about them as they stand. You aren't even allowed to know where the money's coming from within the United States, much less from outside it. So the hypocrisy it's just incredible, that they've a level of not even trying to fool us. And we have defense forces bombing safe zones for humanitarian outreach. I just think that we're beyond the point where they think they even have to try to fool us. If something's from Russia or China, it's bad. And if the same thing is from the United States, it's good, and we aren't even going to pretend that we have the same standards being applied.
Medea?
Well, yes, and it's so dangerous now when you have the two most nuclear armed countries, US and Russia, basically facing off each other in Ukraine. And you have NATO now talking about China, parroting the US and saying China is the real enemy. It's not only is this what the weapons companies need to just keep churning out the billions of dollars in profits to their shareholders, but it puts the world closer and closer to nuclear Armageddon. And that's why I think it's so important for people to read our book about NATO, to come and join us at the NATO protest for the 75th anniversary of NATO, when the US will be hosting NATO in Washington, D.C., a rare occasion that we get to have NATO on our soil, and to join with our European allies and allies throughout the world who are really sick and tired and disgusted with this militarized world that we have become forced to live in, and that has been normalized thanks to the propaganda of NATO countries, and want to create a different world. So that's why it's so important to use this 75th anniversary to educate people about why NATO is such a disaster for the future of humanity.
And do you know about NATO's activities going on in Bulgaria and Serbia? Now, I know like the former Yugoslavia, there always seems to be another flare-up that happens there between the different ethnic groups. But I'm just wondering, because I know Serbia, uh, Slobodan Milosevic was overthrown in basically like a Western-backed color revolution. But since then, Serbia, which has been under different, right wing governments, I would argue far right governments, still hasn't really, drank the Kool-Aid of NATO. So I'm curious if you can talk about that and NATO's activities in Bulgaria.
Medea, do you want to take that?
No, you go for it, David.
Well, I think Medea produced the best bits of our book on this topic, but there is no question that NATO has continued its shameful behavior in Yugoslavia from the breakup until now, and that the people it was fighting against in Serbia were guilty of horrific things, but nothing resembling what NATO alleged. And some of the fraudulent propaganda that we've documented in the book, and alleged mass killings and mass graves and genocidal acts that were not the case, and that were followed by worse killings that came after NATO got involved, as a result of NATO getting involved. This is very poorly understood to this day, which is why you have these wars held up as model wars by peace-loving, just war professors and academics, because the facts were never known. And so I don't think NATO ever lacked a public relations arm, but it has been developing it in recent decades to an extreme extent, and it produces as many YouTubes as it does weapon sales now, and they're influential and they're acceptable and they're never banned for misinformation on any channels, and so this is, we have to keep telling people to go back and look at what really happened in the case of each of these wars, because there has yet to be anything remotely defensible on their own terms in any of the wars NATO has engaged in. Medea mentioned that we're going to be unwelcoming NATO to Washington, D.C. in July, and people can go to nonatoyespeace.org, nonatoyespeace.org, learn all about NATO, sign a statement that's there, sign up to be with us in Washington, D.C. on July 6th, 7th, and beyond. We need those who understand, because so few do, to get involved and move others on this topic.
Can I just add one other dimension on the Eastern European issue, to say that these are countries that were poorer and are poorer than the Western European countries, and yet by joining NATO, they are supposed to abide by this goal of spending 2% of their gross domestic product on the military. And it's just so offensive and so against the real needs of the people of the NATO countries, including our own country, of course, where we have surpassed that goal. And David, are we past 3% now? I think we are just past 3%.
I think so.
In
I
any
mean, it
case,
depends how you count.
we're close to spending $1 trillion on militarizing our country and asking these Eastern European countries, these poorer countries, to be pouring more and more of their funds. And it means for Western Europe, that did have at one time a good safety net of decent health care and good education system, and didn't keep their graduates from universities in lifelong debt, that now they are moving towards the US model, and it's a terrible model. And so I just do want to say that that is part of the reason to be against NATO. Imagine an alliance that says we want you to spend more of your people's resources, your financial resources, on the military, and that is a goal of our alliance. It means that it's an anti-people alliance, and that's something that we will be spreading the message as we get into this 75th quote celebration of NATO's existence.
Before I let you two go, I have three very quick final questions. And Medea, one of my final questions I wanted to ask you is about Ukraine, because I know you've written a book about Ukraine with a co-author, Nicholas
Davies.
Yeah, Nicholas Davies. How do you see the Ukraine? I hope it ends soon. But how do you see the Ukraine conflict ending? Boyan, who I mentioned, believes that Ukraine will be partitioned into 2 or 3 countries, with Western Ukraine, with Kiev as its capital, being aligned with the European Union and NATO, and East Ukraine basically being, if not its own country, which Russia and much of the international community will recognize, it'll be, like Crimea, it'll be a part of Russia, in which, again, only Russia and much of the international community will recognize, but not, NATO and EU member states. I'm curious what you think of that.
I think that the quote solution will be pretty much like the same one that we saw a month after the war began, that could have avoided all of this death and destruction, when they came up with a 15-point plan to end the war that included the neutrality of Ukraine, which is the #1 issue for Russia that could so easily have been solved, and having the people in the eastern part of the country have their own decision making about what they wanted to be, how they wanted to be related to Ukraine and Russia, and put off the issue of Crimea for years to come, which was at one point something that Zelensky was willing to do. So I think in the end, it will be, as I said, very much like could have happened, should have happened, would have happened, had it not been for the interference of the US and the UK to squash those diplomatic solutions to the war, and instead try to use it to weaken Russia, which of course it hasn't done. And no matter how many weapons the West is pouring in, and the US just having passed a legislation for another $61 billion in weapons for Ukraine, and Biden apologizing to Zelensky yesterday, "We're sorry that it took us so long to send in more weapons to you." Despite all of this, we see that either it will be a stalemate or Russia will be winning.
Well, if Ukraine remains united, that might be music to the ears of one of my Ukrainian friends, who actually is from the east of Ukraine. Kharkiv is very much against Russia's invasion, does kind of see, even though knows very well, America's epic crimes against humanity, NATO's epic crimes against humanity, sees NATO as a necessary evil against, Russia. But if the country remains united, that's a bit hopeful, even if there might be bitter divisions amongst the people, right? Or
well, and I think that's certainly a possibility, and we should recognize that we can be against NATO and against Russian invasion as well, which David and I both are.
And then two final questions. Medea, what do you think it's going to take? This is a question I asked many guests, especially Americans, but what do you think it's going to take for the vast people power movements in the United States, from Black Lives Matter to the Latinx left movement to queer liberationists to Palestine justice movement to eco-socialists to the broad peace movement and anti-imperialist movements, to show more urgent solidarity to the plight of Native Americans, Indigenous Hawaiians, and Indigenous Alaskans?
Well, I think that there is a basic solidarity there. If you would ask people, the question is, how do you manifest that solidarity? And I see, as I walk the halls of Congress, there are groups that are connected to the Native American community that are trying to right the wrongs of hundreds of years of US genocide. And we are always meeting and greeting and talking about the relevance for those issues in the issue of Gaza, for example, where the native population is being decimated. I think there is a greater understanding now in this issue of Palestine for the Native American issues than I have seen in a long time. And I also see a greater connection to so many different struggles. I mean, the fact that the NAACP just came out in support of the Palestinian people is you know, maybe we could say it's 8 months too late, but it's a positive thing. And I'm seeing just a lot of more interconnectedness thanks to the horrors that we see every day going on in Gaza. And I also want to say I see more interconnectedness to the militarism issue in general. And while we have had a hard time educating people about NATO, I think to understand that this is part of the militarism that we need to fight against. When I was in the encampments of GW University, there were tents that had signs on them saying, fight the empire, or we have to stand against the war machine. And the fact that there were teach-ins going on here, and I've heard in encampments throughout the universities about how the struggle in Gaza is just a tip of the iceberg, that this is, you know, one part of a much larger study and struggle. And in those, when you look at the teach-ins that I saw that were prepared, were things like the indigenous movement in the United States.
Well, here's hoping that happens. I know one of the protests that I think Mint Press News and Red Nation covered, there's been record levels of Native Americans and Indigenous Australians and Maori people and First Nations Canadians showing up to these humongous Palestine solidarity protests. And I just hope that that when people get in interaction with those members of the Native American community, that they show more urgent solidarity to the plight of Native Americans. David, before I let you go, please explain why you can't be an environmentalist, let alone eco-socialist, and support NATO.
Well, you can't be in support of the biggest entity in one of the most destructive enterprises on Earth and be working to save the Earth. You know, that if you can get people to believe that anything militaries do is necessary, that there's no choice about it, then you can just turn off their brains and you can create trillions of dollars of destruction. You can contribute another 10% to the carbon in the atmosphere. You can divert $2 trillion away from addressing the environment and disease and homelessness and so forth. But once you begin to grasp that these are choices and options and that NATO is not necessary, well, then you have to look at the fact that this is, 70% of the militarism on Earth, and that militarism is a major destroyer of the environment, so destructive that the nations go to extreme lengths to leave it out of even the agreements that they pretend to make and violate, as if the militaries have some second planet to destroy. I think people are grasping this. I think that not only are people increasingly interested in trying to slow the collapse of the climate and the ecosystems, but are increasingly aware of what some of the contributing factors are that propaganda has sought to leave out. And I think, as Medea said, some of the activism that we've seen around Israel-Palestine has not obediently limited itself to Israel-Palestine. Some of it has not been the correctly labeled pro-Palestine. It's been pro-peace, and students have said we want to know where every dollar is going, and we want not a dime to go to any weapons makers. And the fact that some of these universities get more money from the US military than from all their students put together, and are willing to go after their students on behalf of the US military because they see which is worth more to them, has begun to open some eyes, because people recognize that that's not just Israel's wars, that the vast bulk of it is not Israel's wars. It's the world's leading war machine. It's this monstrosity purporting as an international community and a rules-based order, and it's NATO.
And if we don't end, and if we don't end NATO, the pivot to Asia, AFRICOM, or David, I know you'll appreciate me saying this, but if we don't end war as an institution, war is going to end. War is going to end, especially as it is the number. It is as Abby Martin is making her documentary. It is Earth's #1 enemy, wars, and so before we close the program, Medea, because you're a first-time guest, we usually end the program doing the questionnaire that was done by Marcel Proust, later the popular French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, later James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. It's your turn to do this before you both enjoy the rest of the weekend. So, Medea, what is your favorite word?
Empathy.
What is your least favorite word?
It's a hyphen word, but well, I'll just say bombs.
Okay. What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Music.
What turns you off?
Violence.
What's your favorite curse word? And it could be in any language.
Just damn.
Damn, just damn.
Just damn.
Okay. What sound or noise do you love, followed by what sound or noise do you dislike?
Excuse me?
What sound or noise do you love, and then what sound or noise do you dislike?
Sound or noise.
Oh, sound or noise. Do I like? I like drums, beating of drums.
Oh, and then what sound or noise do you dislike?
Sound or noise? Bombs.
Yeah,
bombs and drones.
That you dislike, though.
Yeah, bombs.
Oh, okay, okay. All right, okay. Okay. Then what profession, if you weren't doing all the wonderful peace work that you do with anti-imperialism and wonderful books and so forth, what profession, if you weren't doing yours, would you love to do?
Be a dancer.
What profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Drive a well, I wouldn't like to be in the military, any kind of military, but I also wouldn't like to drive big trucks.
Okay, and if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is your vision of the afterlife? And even if you're an atheist, please answer the question.
Welcome to the world you were trying to create while you were in the other world.
Fantastic. Blessed are the peacemakers, as Jesus would say. And all right, so folks, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Meda Benjamin of Codepink, David Swanson, the brilliant David Swanson. He's always our returning champion of World Beyond War, and they are the authors of a new book which people need to check out. NATO, What You Need to Know. And I'm going to make sure that folks check out both of your organizations, and folks also do donate generously to both World Beyond War and Codepink, and they have lots of cool clothing. Look at Medea's wonderful shirt. Look at David's wonderful shirts. And both of you keep doing the amazing work you do and have a fantastic weekend. I hope you guys have you guys will have a big turnout come July when it's the big anti-NATO demonstrations, right?
Great. Thank you.
Good.
Nice being on with you.
Thanks, Youri.